Aloha. By the way, my name is Michael, and on this group we have Melanie, Siva, and Lauren, and we will be presenting Chapter 10, Racial Discrimination. So I will be the first one to present today. I am going to present the three LOs, the first three LOs, and yeah, so let's start. So the first LO is understanding the social construction of race and theories of racism. So, most scientists agree that race is a social construct with little basis in human genetics or biology. So, what is a social construct? A social construct is something that exists not in objective reality but as a result of human interaction. It exists because humans agree that it exists. So, basically, social construct is how scientists define or how scientists explain racism or race. It exists. We have racism, we have this race. It's because of how we interact to the society. Okay, so another definition of social construction is a theory that is about how we make sense of things. It assumes that we construct mental representation using collective notions as building blocks. In this view, happiness is regarded as social construction comparable to notions like beauty and fairness. So, some examples of social construction is that happiness, love. We social construct happiness, we social construct love as we interact with other people. Okay? Another term here is race. In this LO, we are going to talk about race, racism, and some other common terms about racial discrimination. So, race in America has a profound meaning, even if they're primarily economic, historical, and political. Because I can say that race has a profound meaning in America because US is a multicultural country, as we all know, and because of that, racism is mostly to experience by those who are from the minority groups. So let's proceed to the second slide. What is ethnicity? Ethnicity or an ethnic group or ethnicity is a grouping of people who identify with each other on the basis of shared attributes that distinguish them from other groups, such as common set of traditions, like what they do, their culture, their ancestry, their language, their history, their society, their culture, as I've mentioned earlier, their nation, their religion, or social treatment with their residing area. Example of ethnicity for us to be able to further understand is the commonalities such as racial, national, tribal, religious, linguistic, or cultural origin. Okay, so let's proceed to the third slide. What is racism and discrimination? For us to be able to understand what racism and discrimination is, of course, we have to make ourselves familiar with this term. So racism is based on the belief that some racial group are inferior to others. Like for example, Tongan are better than someone and someone are better than Tongan. That's an example of racism, thinking that your culture or that your nationality is better than others. Okay, so the stereotyping and generalizing about people usually negative because of their race, commonly a basis of discrimination against members of racial minority or groups. And discrimination is more of an action. It is the prejudgment and act of negative treatment of people based on identifiable characteristics such as race, gender, color, religion, or ethnicity. Like, for example, Filipinos are not allowed to buy some stuff in a certain shopping center in the mainland because they're Filipinos. They stereotype Filipinos as they couldn't afford those stuff and they end up doing shoplifting. So that's why they're not allowed to get into that shopping center. So that's an example of discrimination because they discriminate other people because of their prejudgment, because of their race, or because of what they stereotype for Filipinos. Okay, so let's proceed to this video here that I posted on my slide. Why racism is the biggest issue in America. So let's watch this video.
Keep looking past it is one of the really most troubling.
Let's repeat.
Well, race is, as you know, this nation's original sin. We have not really found a way to bring the country together the way that our founding fathers aspired us to do. There is no way that America can be as great as she says she wants to be unless we make sure that what the founding fathers promised us is actually realized by everybody, irrespective of race, creed, or color. When you actually started to talking about race itself and white people's view of race as opposed to African Americans' view of race, mostly white people thought that race in the last 50 years was getting better. Almost every African American we talked to said no, over the last 50 years it has not. The biggest hurdle that we have is that white people who responded to our survey and participated don't really have a full understanding of what institutional racism is in the country. They think it's just an individual act of malice to another person that doesn't look like them. And of course, the African American community sees this in a very, very different way. They will clearly say, and you hear this from kids in Louisville, Kentucky, who are high schoolers, they said to me, Mr. Mayor, talent is equally distributed. There's no way to get around that, but opportunity clearly is not. You have schools that are segregated by race. And as a general rule, if you look at all the schools that have high tuitions, most of the people that go there are white kids, not African American kids. And schools tend to be more segregated than they used to. And academic excellence is sometimes related to how much the teachers are paid, what the resources they have are, and they have a better opportunity. Most white people that we talked to didn't like the word white privilege. They felt like it was an assault on the fact that they didn't work hard. On the issue of reparations, most white people that responded to the survey said things like, I wasn't alive during that time, I didn't have a slave, why should I pay money back? When we, again, started talking to them a little bit more about what white privilege might really look like and used other words to describe it, like, can you ever remember getting the benefit of the doubt that maybe one of your friends that didn't look like you had? Like, if you got pulled over by the police and you didn't have your driver's license, did you get arrested or were you given a summons? What happened to your African American friends? They began to acknowledge that the system actually did treat people differently. It's not hard for people to understand that they didn't learn something the right way. What's hard for them is to acknowledge that we now have to correct it. And so to me, although it was hard to listen to how far we were apart, there always seems to me to be a pathway to common ground if you want to do it. I have been able to witness firsthand the inability of white people to really understand the life that African Americans lead. And of course, as the country continues to get more diverse, we all have to figure out how to live together, not just so that we live in peaceful segregation, so that we actually believe that diversity is a strength, not a weakness, and all of us have the opportunity to realize our God-given potential. Again, not just because it's the right thing to do, which it clearly is, but you cannot win if everybody's not on the field. The call to action is actually very simple, although doing this is really hard, and that's to see every other human being as a human being and judge them based on what's in their soul, not what the color of their skin is. It sounds so simple. It's something that we've been talking about forever, but for some reason we find a really tough time actually doing it, because doing it requires us to think in ways that we haven't been taught. That's a simple call to action, and if you do that in your personal life, and you do that in the way that you interact with everybody else in the community, the world is going to be a better place. But it starts off with whether or not you believe that we are all created equal, and whether all are.
I really like what he said about diversity and things like that. We have to view diversity as strength and not as a weakness, and we should not judge people according to their colors, according to their race and things like that. But we have to embrace diversity. And I think one factor, that's why I've mentioned earlier about America being a multicultural country, it's one of the factors why racism exists, because others think of themselves that they're better than other people, that they're superior and others are inferior and things like that. But as you mentioned, as we inverse or as we accept or as we embrace diversity, it will serve as a strength here in the U.S. Okay, so let's proceed
It's
to
not something that we can go slow on.
continue this
It
one
has
right
been
here.
with us forever, and it has been an urgent crisis since it began. And why we keep
Okay, so I think we're done with that. And yeah, so number two, LO, is that becoming aware of the changing racial profile of the United States in the shifting world of government. Okay, so the United States has been populated by immigrants in a series of waves that began with the arrival of the first Native Americans in the Pleistocene era and continued through successive arrivals from Western Europe, Africa, South and Central America, Asia, and other points across the globe. That's why right now different people living here in the U.S. because of what happened in the past, and until now it's still continuing to happen. And already the world's most racially and ethnically diverse nation, the United States is projected to become even more diverse in coming decades. This group is expected to nearly triple in size and to increase from 15% in 2008 to nearly 30% of the population by 2050. Similarly, a number of Americans who identify as multiracial is expected to triple. Modest growth is projected for Asians, African Americans, and Native Americans. So this is an example of this is like a representation of what's going to happen, like the increase of population according to race on the coming years. So it shows here summary tables in the United States from 2010 to 2050. So in this table, they already predicted what's going to happen in 2050. So we can see here that the white and non-Hispanic, it grows. It will grow from 64 as high as 64.7. Okay, so that's just the representation as they predicted that will happen from 2010. It's been happening from 2010 to 2050. But let's see what happened. Okay. Okay, so the third LO is to reflect on the role of history in shaping the current experience of African Americans. So in this LO, we're going to talk about slavery and enslavement. So what is slavery? So slavery and enslavement are both the state and the condition of being a slave, who is someone forbidden to quit their service for another person while treated as property. Slavery typically involves the enslaved person being made to perform some form of work while also having their location dictated by the slave. Okay, this is a happening, or this is very common during the early days here in the U.S. During the most of the 17th century, laborers on plantations in colonial America were indentured or were indentured. The other term for that is that they are obligated as servants. Okay, so they are obligated servants from Europe. In time, the supply of dentured servants diminished and the slave trade accelerated to the point where the population of African slaves exceeded the European population in southern colonies. Okay, so slavery and aftermath. Okay, so since what happened during that time, some people are really against slavery because it had been happening before. That's why they created this Fugitive Slave Act, and it is from the federal involvement. The first involvement in abolitionist effort came in 1808 when the international slave trade was banned. Even then, Congress did not alter the terms of domestic slavery. That's why the Fugitive Slave Act of 1950 and the Dred Scott decision of 1957 established an obligation to return escaped slaves and denied equal citizenship to Americans, to Africans American. State laws in the South not only treated slaves as property, but they also restricted the activities of white residents to sustain the institution of slavery. Thus, for example, state laws prohibit whites, even slave owners, from teaching slaves to read or write. Owners were also prohibited from freeing their slaves unless the slave left the state. Finally, interracial marriage, even between free adults, blacks and white, was strictly prohibited. That's why, because of this, they created this Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Let's watch for us to be able to further understand what Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is.
Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Fugitive Slave Act. To begin, all of it goes back to the Constitution. Article 4 of the Constitution has a clause that we call the Fugitive Slave Clause, which orders states to deliver up fugitives from labor, the euphemism for runaway slaves, when they are requested by slaveholders. That clause gets translated into the first 1793 statute, which is a civil statute about the returning of these fugitives from labor. That was a law that wasn't well enforced according to Southern slaveholders. They complained about it bitterly, especially in the 1840s, and that's what led to the creation of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. It was part of the Compromise of 1850. This 1850 statute, this was much tougher than the earlier one. They punished people who harbored runaways, members of the Underground Railroad, with both civil penalties and criminal penalties, including up to 6 months imprisonment if they were caught and prosecuted successfully. This is a very controversial measure. It was draconian in theory, but in practice it wasn't well enforced. The Underground Railroad was alive and well in the North in the 1850s. There are more documented escapes than rendition hearings in the years before the Civil War. There were dozens and dozens of people who were tortured and imprisoned in the South because of helping fugitives, but not under federal law, under state slave-stealing statutes. The lack of enforcement of this federal law is what led many southern states to complain in their secession ordinance, for example, in 1860 and 61. What they were complaining about was northern state laws that they thought interfered with the federal system. These are called personal liberty laws, anti-kidnapping statutes that many northern states passed to try to protect black people from being unfairly accused of being runaways. Ultimately, the fugitive crisis is one of the major causes of the coming of the Civil War.
People in large numbers came out and joined what became known as the Red Guards. These largely terroristic organizations were
All right,
used to
I think we're
publicly
done with that. Okay, and this is the Dred Scott decision of 1957 that helped stop slavery during this time. Let's watch this one as well.
The black race has, for more than a century, been regarded as beings of an inferior order, and they have no rights which the white man is bound to respect.
Dred Scott's image was that individual who was denied his freedom, that individual who was treated poorly by the courts, that individual whose case the nation had lost. This is a case that split the United States in two. It could never really be healed through conventional means.
Dred Scott was born into slavery in Virginia. His long struggle for freedom was one link in a chain of events that would eventually free more than 4 million enslaved people. Purchased in a Missouri slave market by Army Dr. John Emerson, Scott was brought to Fort Snelling in 1836 by way of Fort Armstrong in Illinois. When the frontier moved west, Fort Armstrong was no longer needed, so the entire infantry, including Dr. Emerson, was transferred to Fort Snelling.
The slaves in Minnesota were different than the slaves in the South. They made the beds, they made the food, and did the things that the people who were officers couldn't do for themselves.
I think we see Dred Scott more as a personal manservant, or like a butler or steward. Anything that Dr. Emerson needed, Dred was going to be taking care of that. But it is a very different culture than Virginia. He may have seen this as the lesser of two evils.
And when he came to Fort Snelling, there was already a young girl, slave, Harriet, owned, if she could be owned, in free territory by Major Lawrence Tolliver. Major Tolliver was leaving for the winter, and he wasn't going to take Harriet with him. And the way to leave her there was to leave her married to somebody who was going to be within the protection of the fort's walls.
Scott and his wife Harriet remained at Fort Snelling until 1840. They first sued for their freedom 6 years later.
There were one of at least 300 slaves who had sued for freedom in the St. Louis courts before. The majority of them won because they, like the Scots, had lived in free territory.
In the midst of dramatic national events, the Missouri State Supreme Court reversed an earlier decision granting Dred and Harriet their freedom.
The case came to the United States Supreme Court after 11 years of litigation. 11 years, the Scots were in limbo.
The Scots based their United States Supreme Court case on their residence in lands that were part of the Old Northwest Territory and the 1820 Missouri Compromise, territory where slavery was prohibited. In their landmark 1857 decision, the court declared that Congress had acted unconstitutionally in passing those enactments.
Consider the extent of that. The United States Supreme Court declared that the freedom provision under the Northwest Ordinance was unconstitutional. The Scots would have no basis to claim their freedom under that.
Further, on a technical matter, in order to get a case into federal court, you had to be a citizen of one of the states. The court, in a 7-2 decision, declared that the Scots were not citizens of any state.
Not only did Dred and Harriet lose, their slavery be maintained. The secondary dimension of this was that no persons of color, free persons of color as well, were deemed to have any rights that white men were deemed to respect.
We have watched with increasing anxiety the progress of the opinions of the United States Court on the Dred Scott case, till it has finally reached a conclusion, literally making slaveholding legal throughout all the northern states.
The antipathy that was directed at the United States Supreme Court by newspapers was extraordinarily strong. The self-satisfaction that Southern newspapers reported was equally strong.
It is one of the most atrocious law opinions that has ever disgraced the history.
At a single blow, it shatters and destroys the platform of the Republican Party.
5 of the Supreme Court's 9 silk gowns are worn by slaveholders.
The Dred Scott decision will bring the enemies of the South face to face with the Constitution of their country.
We can but foresee that this decision will create everywhere a profound sensation.
This very attempt to blot out forever the hopes of an enslaved people may be one necessary link in the chain of events preparatory to the downfall and complete overthrow of the whole slave system.
After the court case, they were still legally considered slaves. Dred and Harriet eventually did acquire their freedom. Dred died as a free man.
I'm not sure that the Dred Scott case itself would have caused the Civil War if South Carolina hadn't been primed to secede. Their decision was in part based on Northern reaction to Dred Scott. There couldn't be a legislative compromise because the Supreme Court decision took away congressional power to eliminate slavery. There was no political future short of civil war.
Today, Minnesotans can get a glimpse of Fort Snelling as Dred and Harriet's.
All right. Okay, so the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Dred Scott decision of 1857 established an obligation to return slaves and denied equal citizenship to African Americans. And yeah, so state laws in the South not only treated slaves as property during that time, they also restricted the activities of white residents to sustain the institution of slavery. And yeah, so my group mates will continue the presentation about this chapter, slavery and discrimination. And thank you so much for listening and watching. Bye for now.
So before we continue on, a little background of what I'm going to talk about. Asian immigrants came across the Pacific in response to a demand for labor in expanding economy in the western United States. They came first entering California before the gold rush of 1894, followed by a large number of Japanese people whose immigration was carefully managed by their government. Immigrants from Korea, the Philippines, and other Asian and Pacific islands came in smaller groups. So we're going to start off with the first group. We're going to start off with the Chinese immigrants. They came in search of the Gold Mountain, a land of beauty and wealth. Their land was suffering from poverty and chaos that was caused by the wars with the British. And to finance this war, they had to pay a large amount of money that was charged by Western imperialist powers. And the Chinese government raised the taxes that caused many of its people to leave their country. In the 19th century, hundreds, thousands of young Chinese men, primarily the illiterate laborers, came to the United States. They were motivated by stories of countrymen who had spent a few years working in the United States and then returning home with wealth. When the Chinese laborers heard about this, they basically wanted the same thing for them, and so the entrepreneurs hired by the American firms recruited them. There is a myth that there is no evidence that Chinese men were kidnapped and brought to Americas as coolies. Most stayed in California, and some made their ways to southern states where they served as an alternative to African American labor. Naturalization Act of 1970 reserved citizenship for the whites. This is when the Chinese immigrant would do jobs that no white person would want. Nearly 1/4 of California's Chinese population settled in San Francisco. They published a community known as Chinatown and helped the city to become a leader in manufacturing. They were successful as agricultural laborers in California's Central Valleys. The Exclusion Act in 1882 prohibited immigration by Chinese laborers. This is the first legislation that expressly forbade immigration from a specific nation. In 1880, California passed a law prohibiting marriage between a white person and a Negro or a Mongolian or any other type of race that's not white. These laws were remained on the books till the late 1999. When the Chinese started immigrating to the United States, the women were not needed because they had no values in the labor market. Now, the Japanese immigrants were different from the Chinese in several respects. First, in 1885, the first wave of Chinese immigrant that came to the United States, Secondly, their country was not developed, but an empowering world country. For instance, they defeated Russia in 1905 and commanded a measure of respect for its military and economic potential. The Chinese immigrants came not because their country was raising their tax, but they came simply to empower their country. Thirdly, while the Chinese government was not involved in immigration, the Chinese immigration was carefully orchestrated and monitored by the Japanese government, ready to intercede diplomatically if its citizens were abused. So the Japanese immigrations were ready to intervene if its people were in need of help. Thousands worked at the sugarcane fields of Hawaii and others became agricultural laborers in California. Unlike the Chinese, the women came to the United States to work along their husbands' wife or assets to immigration process. The Japanese saw education as the key to their children's advancement, so they would put their kids in school just to gain more knowledge. In 1906, Board of Education ordered all Japanese students, both native and foreign-born, to attend the segregation Oriental School established in Chinatown. David and Kitano note that furrow was disproportionate to the number of Japanese children in San Francisco. Only a very few students were involved at the time of the order. That was a grand total of 93 Japanese students distributed among 23 different public schools, and 25 of them were native-born citizens. The Asian and Pacific Islanders are grouped together. The economic indicators provide some support for the popular view of Asian Americans as a model minority. The group is more likely to have more than 200 workers within a household. Workers of Asian descent tend to be overrepresented in a rank of professional workers. The Asian Americans have historically had a relatively high rate of business ownerships. For instance, the median household income of Asian household in 2014 was the nation's highest, 74,829. Asian household are more likely than others to have income above 100,000 and slightly less likely to report income in below 15,000 per year. The factors that contribute, the life expectancy among Americans of Asian and Pacific Islands descent are more favorable in comparison to the population with non-Hispanic white Americans. Role of history in shaping the current experiences of Native Americans. When the European came to Virginia, the area was already occupied by the Powhatan tribe. Columbus once stated, and I quote, "The Native Americans are the best people in the world. And above all, the gentlest, without knowledge of what is evil, nor do they murder or steal. They are very simple and honest, none of them refusing anything he may possess when he is asked for it. They exhibit great love towards all others in preference to themselves. They would make fine servants. With 50, we should subjugate them and make them do whatever we want." In 1613, Virginia sent its first shipment of tobacco to London. The Naturalization Act, Native Americans were classified as domestic foreigner, which caused them to deny their citizenship. Between 1814 and 1824, because the cotton grew very well in the southeastern United States, the European eagerly made a claim in that territory, where they pushed out the Native Americans out of their own territory and negotiated a treaty forcing the Native Americans to relocate in the west of Mississippi. And the reason behind their argument was that the Native Americans did not fully use the land. And these states that were occupied by the Native Americans were Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. When the Native Americans fought back, they were called savages. In 1829, the Georgia state government passed a law extending their authority to the Cherokees land. Basically, that land was occupied by the Native Americans before they were dragged out. Under the reservation systems, land were assigned to tribes with assurance that they would not be attacked by U.S. militaries. In 1887, the Dawes Act, aka the Indian Emancipation Act, was passed to eliminate the reservation systems. 1924, U.S. citizens were granted to all tribal members. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal offered Native Americans an opportunity to gain tribal control of what was remained of their reservation land. General Richard Pratt was someone that wanted to remove the children from their home and place them in a boarding school either run by the government or a Christian denomination. He was the first person that founded the first Native American boarding school in 1879. 10,000s of Native Americans' children were placed in these schools. They were subject to a harsh daily schedule with only limited time devoted to education and the radar to hard labor. They were punished for revealing any evidence of their culture, such as carrying a medicine bottle or speaking a native language. Here, the children were trained to be domestic servants and agricultural laborers. Most white Americans at the time did not condemn the betrayal made by government representatives. Native Americans were taught that they were less humans than whites and that they were savages by intelligent, well-intentioned individuals. The insatiable desire for native land by whites arose from an economic system that rewarded private wealth at the expense of community and environmental ideas. It was bolstered by religious principles that stressed Christianity's primacy. Finally, it was fueled by a failure to see that different is just that difference. As Reverend Davis put it, not for the better or for the worse, but for the sake of comparison. Tribes that are recognized by the federal government are considered internal and independent nations. The residents of reservations do not pay local property taxes. Native Americans living on a reservation do have the rights to vote in state and local elections. The Indian Child Welfare Act was designed to prevent removal of Native Americans' children. The tribes have jurisdiction over Native American children who enter the child welfare systems, and state authority are required to give preferences to kind and tribes in finding homes for those who are removed due to abuse or neglect. Last but not the least, analyze and critique hate legislations. These are bulletin points of crimes that were put up by the government to guide people in, say, more like a safe way of how they can defend themselves if they have this law down and if they have this law to protect them. And one of the bulletin points that stood out to me, the last one, the Hate Crime Prevention Act of 2009, which makes it a federal crime to attack someone because of disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Sival, and I'm just gonna present on the last part of chapter 10, which is English only law, and I'm gonna talk about some of the important history of the English only law in the United States. And so, English only proposal was supposed in the 1780s when John Adams proposed that the Continental Congress establish an official academy to verify or develop and dictate the usage of English, but unfortunately this proposal was rejected and it was not successful. And also President Jefferson tried to impose an English-only policy on French speakers in Louisiana territory because most people in Louisiana, they speak French, and English-only policy was imposed by Jefferson just to have these people consider English as the one of the language that they should mainly speak. But as a result of that, Louisiana entered a union in 1812, which made them the only state with a non-English speaking majority, or a state that do not speak English. And English only became the law of the land in the state of California. So California was part of the states that also enforced the English law, and or English only law, so that people can speak English only in the state of California. And the Native Americans was forced into the English only road, and they were involved taking their children apart from home because they were punished for speaking their own language or speaking their Native American language. So it was kind of hard for these people because they don't want to speak English and they don't want to take away their language, but they were forced to speak English just so that they only use one language instead of their native language or their Native American language. So the legislation was advanced at the federal, state, and the state level, and it restricts the use of other languages for government business. So mostly government business, they use English aside from other languages. So it was very strict, and were they were supposed, or it's a must for them to use English with most of government issues, government business, or whatever things that the government do regarding speaking languages. They will use English in anything. And so in 1980s, the constitutional amendment was proposed to ban the using of other languages that other than English by federal, state, and local governments. Also, the Republic leadership in the House of Representatives passed a motion to stop the use of other languages other than English by federal government. Also, the Congress that considered making English the official language of the USA, and they also proposed amendments of the Constitution that would like to make English the official language of the nation, or make English the main language in America for people to speak. And so here are some of the states that are currently enforcing or using the English only law. It is Alaska, Arizona, Kansas, and California. And here are the dates that they are starting to enforce or use the English only law. And some proponents of English only legislation offer several arguments, and these arguments are they suggest that bilingual education delays or prevents the affecting or English by immigrants. They think that immigrants today refuse or deny to learn the English language, but they insist on government-sponsored bilingual programs. And also, they argue that the United States is at risk of becoming separate like Quebec or India. One of the senator, Ohio Senator Steve Sines, he introduced an English only amendment to the U.S. Constitution, argued that countless hundreds of thousands lost their lives in language riots of India. So basically means that he thinks that the United States might be separate, or states people might be separate because they might be confused of using so many languages, and that's why they wanted to have English to become one language for everyone to focus on or to use. And they also suggest that English is a common bond holding Americans of diverse backgrounds together, which is making Americans become one group of people using one language so that everyone can understand what they're talking about, or just use one language to communicate to make everything easy. The other part is standardized testing on people of color. So this was made to identify the skills of African American people while applying for jobs, and it was hard for them to go through job search because most of them did not pass these tests, and because of this test, they are race neutral, and it will tell the employer whether this person, especially the Black people, or African Americans, are qualified for the job. So the test will identify the skills, if they have higher skills, or if they qualify for the job. So, but it was made for African American people. So it was designed to measure their general aptitude or their skills, talent, and yeah. So the consequences for standardized testing was consistently operate against people of color. And one of the similar test was Stanford Binet test that used to support the notion of that Northern Europeans persecuted other races. And so this employment testing was used during the 1960 hiring and promotion decision. But due to the poor education of African American people, most of them did not qualify or did not have the equal opportunity that other people have because of this test. So this test made them not qualified for the job, or whatever job that they applied for. And last is factors that can interfere with the voting rights of Americans of color. So it was long after the Civil War, Southern states used the range of tactics to keep African Americans from voting. So they try to avoid having African Americans to vote. And good example of this is in Mississippi, the mayor and all white city councils decided to cancel the 2001 local election after a large number of African Americans declared that their candidacy for office. So another one is second generation practice include redistricting that eliminate voting districts with a majority of African Americans and Latino voters, moving both places out of minority neighborhoods, eliminating the option of early voting, and establishing the context of duplicated registration requirements. One of the other practice was known as a felony disenfranchisement, and almost 6 million of Americans have lost their rights to vote due to felony convictions. And there are several states that denies the right to vote to anyone who convicted of a felony, even though they some of them have devised complex procedures to the right they can be pursued. So it was hard for some convicted people to vote if they were in this felony or if they were convicted people. So some racial disparities in rates of arrest, conviction, and sentencing people of color are disproportionately represented among these disenfranchised. So mostly this is related, or this is applied to the African American people. So one good example is the Florida state. The sentencing project reported that almost a quarter or 23% of the African Americans are voting. age do not legally vote, and it is sad for them because this mostly affect the right of these African Americans to legally vote or have a chance to vote. So racial discrimination is a very big impact or effect on people, especially these minority groups such as African Americans, Latinos, and other groups in America that affected by racial discrimination and make them less their opportunities in most of the things such as work, school, votings, and so much more. And I think that's it, and that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lauren Garcia, and today I will be speaking about Hispanic and Latino immigrants, and I'll also be going into some policies in the United States that address discrimination and some policies internationally that also address discrimination. So first, I identify as Latina. Immigration is something that's like near and dear to my heart. Both of my parents are immigrants. My dad's from Ecuador, and my mom's from Guatemala. And I have such a huge respect for them and any immigrants because I know the extent of like all the sacrifices that they made to come here and to make a better life for themselves and their family. And so I found a TED Talk, and in this TED Talk, this girl, she speaks about what being Hispanic and Latinx means in the United States, and she puts it really eloquently. So we will be watching that.
In December 2016, one of the top trending videos on YouTube was of a person who was shouting at a Hispanic woman who she considered had cut her in line at a JCPenney store. Some of the statements made were, I quote, "Go back to wherever the F you come from. Probably on welfare, the taxpayers probably paid for all that stuff. You're nobody. Speak English. You're in America." The people in the back did nothing to stand up for this Hispanic woman, and even one seemingly nodded in agreement with the awful statements made. I consider myself a Spanish and English-speaking Latina, Hispanic, and first-generation Mexican-American born in the United States. Over and over again, I thought to myself, what if it would have been I in that woman's position? Imagine yourselves at the end of that receiving line of such horrifying insults, and then have people in the back agree with the stereotypes being made about a part of your identity. Unfortunately, the statements made in the video are common stereotypes about Latinos and Hispanics in the US. But unlike it was implied, not all Hispanics and Latinos are immigrants, not all Hispanics and Latinos are on welfare, and not all Hispanics and Latinos speak Spanish. Let's take a second to define Hispanics and Latinos. Hispanic is a term that refers to people who come from Spanish-speaking countries, such as Mexico, parts of Central and South America, like Guatemala, Colombia, and it even includes the Caribbean, such as Cuba and Puerto Rico. Latino, Latina, or Latinx, to represent people of all genders, refers to people who have origins in Latin American countries. And unlike Hispanics, this term includes Brazil and Haiti. The woman in the video was called a nobody. But as you can see, Latino and Hispanic are not terms synonymous with a nobody. In fact, Latinos and Hispanics have a growing presence in the United States. Latinos make up about 18% of the US population. That makes Latinos the largest minority group in the US, and one that is ever growing. It is projected to grow by 30% by 2060. This is one reason why politicians advocate for the Latino vote more and more. Every 30 seconds, a Latinx turns 18. Those are a lot of potential voters. But not only in politics do we see the growing presence of Latinos and Hispanics. This presence can also be seen in the economy. Latinos have become a growing consumer power, one that was in 2015 equal to $1.3 trillion. That's equal to the GDP of Mexico, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, and Guatemala combined. But not only through buying products do Latinos help out the economy. The formation of Latino-owned businesses skyrocketed 47%, while non-Latino businesses declined by 2%. New businesses means new jobs. And a 2012 Stanford study found that Latino-owned businesses employed 2.5 million workers. Perhaps somewhere unexpected and surprising that Latino influence can also be found is in food. I bet many of you this month have had tortilla chips and salsa for a midnight snack. In addition to these foods, tamales, empanadas, and many others have become quite popular in the US. And it's all thanks to Latinos who have preserved these foods from their family's place of origin. The United States cannot deny that Latinos play an important role in our country. We cannot allow them to be disparaged by the misconceptions we create about them. Instead, we should try learning about the Latino and Hispanic experience in the US. If not, it can lead to incidents like those experienced by Judge Curiel Gonzalo when he was mislabeled by our own president as Spanish and implied to be hostile because he was Hispanic. Spanish is a term that refers to people who have origins in or come from the country of Spain. Judge Curiel Gonzalo has Mexican ancestry and is from New Jersey. To avoid incidents like those experienced by the judge, we have to first tackle a few misconceptions, such as the definition of Latino and Hispanic. Latino and Hispanic are not terms that define race, like Asian, Caucasian, or African American. Hispanic and Latino are terms that describe ethnicity, which means that instead of people sharing common physical features, they share a national or cultural identity. In fact, Latinos can identify with any race. The 2012 census found that 53% of Latinos said they were white, and 37% said they were of some other race. And speaking about origins, although it is a misconception that most Latinos and Hispanics are immigrants, many Hispanics have been in the US, or the land that was to become the US, for quite a while now. It all started in 1565 with St. Augustine to form the first European settlements in Florida, thus introducing the Spanish language to Florida. The Spanish continued to settle in parts of the Southwest and the land that was to become Mexico. In 1848, Mexico ceded a lot of its land to the United States in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And these Mexicans remained on these territories acquired by the US, and they became citizens in the 1930s. You have to account for so much diversity when talking about Hispanics and Latinos, because not one person is the same, and not one person is defined by two words you check off a census sheet. Raquel Cepeda summed it up best by saying, Latino means being from everywhere. And that is exactly what America is supposed to be about. With that said, I encourage all of you not to do something like this guy did, who tweeted, #Happy Cinco de Mayo. The best taco bowls are made in the Trump Tower Grill. I love Hispanics. The first problem with this picture is that taco bowls are not even an ethnic food to Latinos and Hispanics. The second problem is that Cinco de Mayo is a Mexican tradition, and not all Hispanics are Mexican. The third problem is that if this politician really wished to rally Hispanic and Latino votes, then he should have known that even most Hispanics and Latinos rather be identified by their family's place of origin. James A. Forbes said it best when he said, when people rely on surface appearances and false racial stereotypes, rather than an in-depth knowledge at the level of the heart, mind, and spirit, our ability to assess and understand people accurately is compromised. Through this talk, I have learned so many things about what it means to be Latino and Hispanic. I did not know the difference between these two terms before I began this talk. But because of this, I encourage all of you that before formulating an opinion or a bias against any group of people, to ask questions, inform ourselves, and take risk by putting ourselves in other people's shoes and trying to see the world through their eyes. I encourage all of you to talk to the person you don't really know so well, or the one you've never talked to before. If you do, you can learn something interesting about them, and maybe they can learn something interesting about you. And in this way, we come to a complete understanding of one another as human beings. Thank you.
And so something that I really liked in her TED Talk was how she said that before formulating an opinion about someone who's different than you, it's important to ask questions and like really just inform yourself and educate yourself. And I think one of the biggest ways to combat discrimination and like stereotypes is through education and just like putting yourself in other shoes. Next, I'll be talking about the role of immigration in race relations in the United States. So in the textbook, it states that the nation has refined its immigration policies in pursuit of three stated goals. So the first one is exclusion, which is like excluding groups considered undesirable by the majority. Next is economic advancement, promoting domestic economic interests. And then the third is humanitarian relief, which is like providing a haven for the oppressed and permitting families to remain together. So like an example of this would be asylum. When you like look at immigration policy through the lens of like systemic racism, it's pretty easy to see that undocumented immigrants face far harsher consequences than white Europeans of like years past for the same exact offense or unauthorized entry. So if you like just like examine it, it's pretty like simple that like the systems and policies that are placed and like held in the United States today treat immigrants differently based on their race. And this is an example of structural racism. So there are multiple groups that address discrimination in the United States. An example of that would be the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So their mission is to secure the political, educational, social, and economic rights of Black people and to eliminate race-based discrimination. Another example would be the Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center. And in this, it's a nonprofit organization that works to serve the legal needs of low-income immigrants who can't afford legal aid or lawyers. And then another example of a program would be the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union. And this group seeks to ensure constitutional freedoms for every gender, race, and sexual orientation. Some international programs I found were the IMADR, which is the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism. And so this group has devoted itself to eliminating discrimination and racism globally. They strive to empower and advocate for those who are discriminated against. They also have, it's a global network, and so they work with minority groups in Asia, Europe, North, and Latin America. Another example would be the UNESCO, or UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And so this group focuses on combating all forms of racism by advocating for human rights. And a way that they've done this is by implementing human rights education in school curricula globally. And so I've had a really good time learning about these international programs and the programs that are in the United States, because it is clear that one of the only ways to eliminate discrimination and racism is through resources and coming together and educating yourself. Yeah, that is my portion, and here are the sources.